Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A hectic start to the weekend at the Mexican Grand Prix. Max Verstappen not a happy man after Friday practice. Yes, he tops the times at the end of the second session, but that does not tell the whole story of the session by any means. The long run pace was a very different story, especially compared to what the McLarens and really Lando Norris was capable of. Qualifying though could be a very different story indeed. What is going to happen today on a critical weekend, as all of these weekends will be for the World Championship. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always, I greatly appreciate it. Just to mention quickly, I'm in a swimming competition in Sheffield this weekend, so getting the videos done like when I normally would is a little bit more of a challenge, and the sessions I'm doing are early mornings, so I don't exactly know what will happen tonight after qualifying. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, still a fascinating weekend so far. This is George Russell watching from the sidelines in the first session when Frederick Vesti was in his car, which I thought was pretty brilliant. So let's just crack on with things, right? Now, first of all, big questions yesterday on the cost cap, and many of you guys had your theories, what was going on. I still think the prevailing wisdom tends to suggest that Williams even made comments on it at the end of last season. They apparently were telling the FIA, like, look guys, if we have another crash here, we are literally not going to be able to afford to stay in the cost cap. And they were told, well, not our fault, right? And maybe fair enough. But yeah, it's a theory anyway. This guy says, me and the boys getting ready to defend Max if Red Bull breach the cap, and Mark Hughes says, stand down. So effectively it's like, it's not Red Bull, so it's not Aston because they have a minor breach, so it can't be them as well. It's not Red Bull because, well, Mark Hughes says it's not Red Bull. So who is it, right? We'll see. Maybe in due course we'll find out. I'm sure the journalists know. Now, let's talk about a few things before we got to practice. This is one key one. Laura McKee says that there's no rush decision on Tsunoda. I think some were expecting maybe after Mexico they would just announce it. Look, maybe they still will. I think if Horner was still there, they would, to be honest. But it does feel like McKee wants to give a little bit of a longer leeway to Yuki than Horner would have done. And I get that. But also, I think their decision has to be relatively clear. Like you could keep Yuki alongside Max for another year and just run it back as it is. But based on what happened in practice with Lindblad, and I know it's only one practice session, but like Lindblad has felt like he's going to get the seat at Racing Bulls for some time anyway. So then what are you going to do? You're going to kick Lawson out? Maybe you are. Maybe you'll have to eventually. Hadjar stays for another year. I don't know. I think Hadjar with his podium in the Netherlands, you probably just got to promote him. It's certainly a Red Bull thing to do. But we know that McKees, given he worked with Yuki at Racing Bulls, Marco's a bigger fan of Yuki than Horner was, so maybe there's a world where Yuki stays. I still think it's very unlikely, but well, they are now suggesting they're not going to make that decision immediately. Now, the other key thing on Red Bull this weekend is yet more upgrades. They've done it again. You couldn't make it up. They have a revised floor. And, I mean, it is actually kind of incredible how it's not just one change. They're bringing loads of things, Red Bull. Like, every weekend, they've got a new upgrade. And it's not the final one. So, it will be a fascinating championship to look back at, right? Because, like, if Max does win this championship, as many consider him the favourite currently to do, and maybe I actually quickly looked at the odds this morning, and his odds to win the championship actually gone up based on second practice. But if you look at the nitty-gritty, like if you look at the details, it's not as clear as that at all, and we'll get to it in a second. The point is, if Max wins this championship, it will be largely due to his own brilliance, but it will also be a remarkable season to look back on because McLaren have basically not changed their car in months. Red Bull have gone very, very hard to try and give Max a chance, and fundamentally he's given himself the chance, and the McLaren drivers have opened the door. But it's definitely a fascinating one where McLaren have not responded to what Red Bull have tried to do. But it may not matter. Their car in these conditions in long run pace may just be too good. Or can Red Bull find something overnight? Paul Monahan, who is still there at Red Bull, one of the guys that is, after lots of the exodus over the last couple of years, says that there will still be further small upgrades. Helmut Marko even said the other day they've got something else up their sleeve. This, by the way, is a look at the floor. So, like, unless you can see air like Adrian Newey, can you tell why the top one is worse than the bottom one? Or maybe better, right? Who knows, based on practice last night. But anyway, this is the slight floor tweak that they've made. This was the old floor at the top. This is the new floor at the bottom. So I mean, it actually is a relatively, substantial change. If you look at this green area that the race have highlighted here, it is quite a different shape, especially at the top and in some of these little winglets. I don't know how long they've been cooking this up for, but again, they are doing everything they can, Red Bull, to give this a go for this season. Now, I've actually decided to refrain from comments on this graphic this time. You guys might remember I talked the other week about these AWS graphics on car performance. I'm simply going to present it without comments and then swiftly move on. Let's talk about practice. This is Oscar Piastri off the track. Lots of runoff, as we know, in Mexico, so plenty of room to get it wrong. But we know that this has not been a good track for Piastri, right? The last 2 years here, he's come 8th both occasions. Today wasn't looking all that much better. You can see all the downforce as well cranked onto these cars in Mexico because very high above sea level, the air is rather thin. You can go quick in Mexico. Like, I think Hamilton topped out at 352 kilometers an hour or something in the second practice session because he wasn't in the first one, but it's still a higher downforce track. Does that suit Red Bull as well? I mean, obviously it's been a great track for Red Bull and Max. Historically, he's won like 5 of the last 6 or something, but as we know, their car has done very well at some of the lower downforce tracks this year generally, but even then Singapore and others, the Red Bull is obviously a lot better than it was. And over a single lap, as I've said now for some time, Max is the favourite over a single lap everywhere we go. But over a race distance, I still think that is a bit of a question mark. So, Charles Leclerc tops first practice, ahead of Antonelli, ahead of Nico Hülkenberg. Now, again, weird session, because you've got tons of rookies in the car. One of the notable things, Lindblad was 6th, and Tsunoda only 8th. Now, of course, immediately loads of talk about this. They were on different compounds, to be fair. Now, there's talks both ways. Either Tsunoda's terrible, or Lindblad's amazing, or the compounds, or actually Max's car is clearly way better than Yuki's and it's sabotaged, so Lindblad's better, right? People have all sorts of theories. Anyway, Lindblad did a good job because, let's be honest, Lindblad was told, and the team even said this, whatever you do, Arvid, do not crash that bloody car. let's make sure you keep that thing out of the wall and do not cause any issues. And that's what he did, and he did some respectable lap times as well. So I think that he has probably done enough now to secure his spot at Racing Bulls next season. I thought that it was like a guarantee that he was going to get promoted a while ago. I still think he will, and they put him in another session here. Tons of rookies, as we know, mostly down towards the bottom of the grid. A bit of a Ferrari sandwich going on as well. Piastri was 4th. Not bad, but still, given that he's got all the sessions, he was behind Hülkenberg in a bit of a Sauber sandwich. So yeah, as some of the guys said, Lindblad was told, look, do not crash Max's car, whatever you do. And Marco even doubled down and said it was a difficult situation for Arblet. He was told, don't do anything wrong, don't crash the car. He still delivered, fastest rookie. Technical feedback was also impressive. We are very happy with him. So, you know, it's doubtful he doesn't get a Formula 1 drive next season. Now, before we get to FP2, I wanted a quick comment here, really, on the McLaren cooling. Because Mexico's quite a tough track for cooling because of the temperatures relatively warm, but also because the air is thinner, it's more difficult to get enough air to cool the engine. So you tend to see lots of cars are running pretty much maximum cooling. And, Duquesne is kind of talking about what McLaren are up to. But what I really wanted to look at here is this cooling louvre, because it's actually remarkable. And as I think Duquesne is basically saying that McLaren are running the same cooling as they ran in the winter tests when it was cold, right? Like, I mean, effectively, this, for example, is the Ferrari. These, for example, are the Ferrari cooling louvres. And yeah, Ferrari are still fast in a straight line. Obviously, this adds drag, more drag than you would like. McLaren are a bit of a draggier car anyway. But if you accept a bit, more drag naturally, or if you can get less drag due to the cooling louvres, then you can generate the downforce in a more efficient way. So this is what Ferrari are doing. We know that historically Ferrari have had issues with overheating in Mexico. Yeah, they won here last year, but historically they would always struggle with like turbo overheating around here. because Ferrari tend to run a smaller turbo than the other teams, and in Mexico it gets a bit starved of oxygen. So anyway, Ferrari, their cooling louvres are massive, and this is the comparison actually to the other teams. So it's actually remarkable, I think. Every team has a different approach. This is Red Bulls in the middle. We just saw the Ferrari ones, which are huge. Of course, there's the Mercedes ones. They're all designed in a slightly different way, of course. It's kind of like, I'm sure the engineers are loving looking at these graphics. We've got Aston Martin, we've got Alpine, right? But there's a lot of cooling, right? Even on the Alpine, when the louvres are closer together, they've still got plenty of them open. McLaren are running like no cooling compared to the other teams, which is truly remarkable. And this is a comparison of last year. So these were McLaren's cooling louvres last year. And they were running again, pretty much maximum cooling or close enough to what they could run on this car. This year, I know there's another gap here, right? So maybe it looks smaller than it is, but I still find it quite incredible they're able to run this level of cooling. Now look, could it backfire? I don't know. But clearly they believe, based on the information they have, that they can get away with this. And other teams seemingly believe that they cannot. That's extremely impressive. And again, I think does show that whatever you say about, well, McLaren fumbling the bag this season, their drivers not maybe executing as well as they could have done, Max making a big comeback and Red Bull making massive progress with their car, it's clear that still in certain areas, McLaren do retain a technical advantage. And I think that is clear in certainly cooling this season. They've been incredibly impressive with the way they've been able to package that car. And there might still be circuits, maybe this one, where it gives them a substantial performance advantage. This was Max exploring a little bit in the second free practice session, which ended like this. So Max was fastest, a 1:17.3, a tenth and a half to Charles Leclerc, a tenth, nearly 2 tenths to Antonelli. So again, the Mercedes and the Ferraris on a single lap, they are in the mix, and that is critically important for qualifying later on today. But is it the be-all and the end-all? Not necessarily. So Lando, who was very quick on the day, he was 2.5 tenths off Max. That is a big gap, right? That is a seriously big gap. Hamilton was right there as well. Then George, so Antonelli looking good so far. Sonoda, 5 tenths off Max. Then Alonso, etc., further down the order. Pretty tightly packed grid, apart from the Alpines. You guys know how it is. Again, Gasly looking a bit checked out. He'll be back next season, I imagine. But the key talking point, Oscar Piastri, down in P12, right? So 12th for Oscar. He was like 6 tenths off Lando. And I don't know what exactly has happened here. I know that he did struggle in these circuits last year. And maybe they don't suit him especially well as a driver, and he's in maybe a bit of a negative spiral at the moment. But it's still worth noting that this was a similar gap between the drivers as there was in Austin at times. In race pace, it was like 4-5 tenths. In optimal qualifying laps, it was like 5-6 tenths, maybe 3 tenths on just standard laps. So notable for sure, right? Because this was kind of the same gap they had in race runs, we'll get to in a second. But that's the key data, right? So, look, Max, top of the timesheets. Wow, unbelievable. He's going to win the championship. McLaren's aren't even close. Oscar's fallen off and all this. It's not as clear as that. That might be the initial takeaway. It's not as clear as that because of the long run data. So F1 Big Data puts it together, and I'll just bring up this graphic here because I think it's a nice way to describe what was going on. So these are the long runs. Now, not everyone was running the soft tyres. Some ran the mediums, right? Which is probably going to be more of the race tyre. So who knows how they would have got on that. Now, very interesting looking at this because you've got Leclerc, who was all over the place, really, in terms of his lap times. But Verstappen, he did 10 laps on the mediums. He was averaging 1:22.8 or something. We'll have a look at the actual numbers in a second. But those like median lap times were in the high 1:22s. Basically where Hamilton was, basically where Alonso was, not where Russell was, and nowhere near where Lando was. So, if we look at the overall numbers here, now, obviously, Max was on the mediums, so it's kind of a little bit more difficult to compare to the McLarens, but Lando was, again, absolutely the standout, and Charles Leclerc was quite happy with his car today. Like, he was pretty happy with qualifying runs, he was pretty happy with the race runs, but he was like, oh my god, if that McLaren pace is real, it's ridiculous. And maybe McLaren took the fuel out, they were running, a soft tyre stint. Who knows, right? Exactly what they were doing. But the Lando 121.8 average lap time, and Behrman wasn't far off, to be fair. But like the fact that Behrman was at a 122.2 on the soft, Piastri was 6-7 tenths off Lando. You can't imagine that they would be running different fuel levels. Maybe they would be between their drivers, but like that would just kill Piastri's confidence, right? You'd think that'd not be a McLaren thing to do. So who knows? Then Hülkenberg, Colapinto, but the point is that Piastri was 7 tenths off Lando, lap by lap, and who was doing a 122 mid. Verstappen was doing a 122.8, 2 tenths off Russell, and Russell was not really that quick. So I think very, very fascinating. And the key takeaway immediately for Max was like, damn, that was not good. So this is the key thing to note today, is that, yeah, Max topped the timings, great. But that's not the full story, because as he says, the short run on the soft was good. We got a good lap in, but everything else was pretty bad. The medium short run wasn't great. The big one was the long runs. We seemed to struggle a lot. That is a big concern for the race. Now, look, Red Bull have turned it around before. They'll probably do so to an extent again. Can they match the McLarens? Good question, especially Lando. The balance wasn't even off. There was just no grip. That's the biggest concern. If you're going to try and do a sustainable run, the tyres are getting hot out of nowhere. And that's also on the mediums, right? If the mediums are getting hot, that's a concern. Tough one to figure out. You can be fast over a lap, but if you've got zero pace in the race, it's going to be very tough. Look, will Max still stick it on pole? There's a very good chance that he does. He's the qualifying favourite, I think, everywhere we go right now. That remains the case right now with this Red Bull. Will he be difficult to overtake? Yes. But if he has no race pace and he's a second off where the McLarens are, it's going to be very challenging to hold them back. It is what it is. Unless he pulls out some 2021 level tactics, or Mexico 2024 level tactics for that matter. So Max says we're nowhere. He also goes on to say it's a big concern for the race. I think we already saw that quote. Lando was commenting on it as well, because it wasn't smooth for McLaren exactly. Yeah, the long run pace was unbelievable, but the single lap stuff wasn't great. So I think there is a balancing act either way. You might say, oh, the McLaren, they just leave it as it is, and then they'll dominate Max in the race. But like, if they qualify 4th and 5th or something, or even worse, because their single lap pace isn't good, they've got to work on that too. So for McLaren overnight, there might have to be some level of sacrifice here. They give back a little bit of single lap pace to try and make sure that they're better in, or give back a little bit of long run pace to make sure they're better on a single lap. So, you know, Lando says, look, we're struggling with the single lap stuff at the minute. We're working hard. The balance is a bit all over the place. So, look, Lando, I don't know, it just feels like in this kind of situation where the McLaren currently is, he's definitely thriving more than Oscar is. Does it mean that the McLaren is an absolute rocket ship in all conditions? Absolutely not as it stands. It's going to be a fascinating qualifying later today, and of course what that means for the Grand Prix as well. So yeah, early video this morning, but very much enjoyed your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.